Apache woman was forced to marry a middle-aged cowboy. She refused his touch. Until one night. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The snow thickened as the three riders pushed along the narrow ridge road leading toward the small ranch tucked at the base of the San Juan foothills. The wind cut through the pines with a steady, sharp sound, the kind that made every breath burn in the throat. Tala walked in front of the horses because the men wanted her in sight. Her wrists were marked from the binding that had held her during the long ride, and every step sent a dull ache through her ankles where the cold had stiffened the skin. She tried not to focus on the pain. She kept her back straight and her eyes forward because any sign of weakness made her feel as though she was surrendering a part of herself she still controlled. Her deerskin dress had torn at the hip where one of the men had grabbed her earlier in the day, and the frayed seam across the chest pulled open enough to show the soft line of cleavage she couldn't cover. She didn't waste energy adjusting it. She refused to let these men see her scramble to hide anything they had already exposed. Her hair, braided tight with leather and bone pieces, hung heavy between her shoulder blades, brushing against the thin fur collar she had been given only to prevent frostbite, not comfort. Behind her, the riders murmured about the weather, the trail, and the deal that had been struck to settle a dispute involving stolen cattle and an elder who owed more than he could repay. Tala heard every word. She understood exactly how she ended up here, traded away without a chance to object. The knowledge settled in her stomach like ice. Her tribe's decision still stung more sharply than the cold around her. When they reached the ranch, she saw the cabin first. Thick logs, a sloped roof coated in frost, a fence corral half buried in drifting snow. Smoke rose from a metal pipe near the back, showing someone was inside before the riders even called out. A smaller shed stood nearby, with a broken window patched by nail boards. Nothing about the place suggested warmth or welcome. It looked like a man had built it only to survive, not to live. The door opened and Boaz Lorne stepped out slowly, as though his body argued with him every time he moved. He leaned slightly to one side due to an old injury that had never properly healed, and his left hand stayed close to the edge of his coat where a revolver hung low at his hip. His beard caught small bits of frost, his pale blue eyes squinted against the wind, and his shoulders carried a heaviness that made him look older than his years. He didn't look surprised to see them, just tired. Boaz had lived alone for a long time. A fever years ago had taken more from him than he admitted out loud. His wife, his 2 young children, and a piece of himself that had never grown back. He kept the ranch out of obligation because some habits were hard to abandon. Cattle didn't care about grief. Winters didn't care about memories. Work gave him structure, and silence filled the space where emotion used to be. The trader dismounted, gesturing toward Tala as if she were an item listed on a ledger instead of a person. He repeated the terms of the agreement with a tone that suggested Boaz had no right to object. Boaz listened without shifting his posture. He didn't glance at Tala long, only enough to register who she was, a tall, bronze-skinned Apache woman with fierce eyes and a posture that resisted defeat even when exhaustion showed around her mouth. Boaz didn't say he wanted her. He didn't say he didn't want her. He simply nodded because the trade had already been completed miles away, and he knew refusing now would only draw violence to them both. He didn't trust the men delivering her. Their smirks said too much. Their hands sat too eagerly near their rifles. When the rope binding her wrists was cut, Tala pulled her hands close to her stomach and worked her fingers to bring back feeling. The cold stung sharply through the cracked skin. She didn't speak. She wasn't sure what would happen if she did. Instead, she studied Boaz with a guarded expression, trying to see whether he was another threat or something quieter. She found no hunger or cruelty in his gaze, just restraint. The riders didn't linger. They mounted again and left without ceremony, disappearing into the blur of falling snow. When their silhouettes vanished fully, the land around the cabin fell silent except for the steady crackle of ice beneath their horses' tracks settling into the ground. Boaz finally addressed her with a short instruction. Get inside before the cold gets worse. His tone carried no force. He sounded like someone who didn't know how to talk to another living soul anymore. Tala hesitated a moment before stepping past him. She wanted to show no fear, but entering a strange man's home made the back of her neck tighten. She braced her jaw, walked through the doorway, and let the heat from the fire inside wash over her skin. The warmth made her eyes sting unexpectedly. She blinked against it and studied the interior carefully. The cabin had a single large room with a kitchen area near the window, a sturdy table that looked hand-built, and a stone fireplace stacked with heavy logs. The place smelled faintly of smoke, pine sap, and old leather. Ducks hung cleaned and strung near the back door. A coat rack held only 2 garments: his coat and what looked like an old, faintly feminine shawl no one had worn in many years. Tala's instincts kicked in. She checked corners, doorways, and the distance between herself and the exit out of habit gained from months of uncertainty. Her pulse slowed only slightly when she realized Boaz kept his distance near the threshold, not blocking her path. He pointed toward a small room at the end of the hallway. "You can stay there." His voice was gruff from disuse rather than anger. Tala entered the room with slow and cautious steps. The scent hit her first, faint lavender clinging to the wooden walls. She stopped when she recognized what kind of space she stood in. A child had once lived here. A carved wooden horse rested on a shelf, the eyes scratched from handling. A small set of blankets lay folded at the foot of the narrow bed. Everything was untouched, as if frozen in time. Her chest tightened. It was the first moment since morning that fear pushed past her anger. Not fear of Boaz harming her. Fear of the unknown life ahead. Fear of being swallowed by a place built on grief she barely understood. Her jaw clenched as she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms against the rough quilt to ground herself. Boaz appeared in the doorway, but didn't step inside. He looked at the room the same way she did, though for different reasons. The loss behind his eyes stayed silent, but Tala noticed the faint tension in his shoulders and the way his breath stalled for a second before he exhaled slowly. He left without saying anything else, giving her space she didn't know she needed. Tala stayed seated for several minutes, piecing together the situation with slow, deliberate thought. She had been delivered to a stranger because her tribe wanted a debt erased. Boaz had not requested her and clearly didn't know what to do with her. She had no escape in this weather. Running into a snowstorm meant death. Staying meant navigating a man who kept his emotions hidden behind a wall she couldn't see through yet. She weighed these facts with the same measured logic she used in dangerous moments before. No panic, only calculation. Eventually, she stood and walked into the main room, needing to understand her surroundings. Boaz sat in a chair near the fire, elbows resting on his knees, coat still on, boots planted firmly, as if he had been frozen in that posture long before she arrived. The firelight hit his face in a way that revealed deep grooves carved by years of worry and solitude. Tala spoke for the first time since arriving, her voice steady but low. "I don't belong here." Boaz didn't look away from the flames. "I didn't ask for this either." His answer wasn't hostile. It was honest. The simplicity of his reply wasn't comforting, but it wasn't threatening either. Tala crossed her arms over her chest, careful not to draw attention to the torn seam. Her heart remained tense, but something in her eased slightly. He wasn't claiming her. He wasn't demanding anything. He sounded like a man forced into a situation he didn't want, but wasn't cruel enough to reject someone who would freeze outside. Night settled heavily. Wind pressed snow against the walls, and each gust made the logs creak. Tala returned to the child's room and lay beneath the quilt, not undressing, keeping her boots near the side of the bed in case she had to move quickly. Her eyes stayed open for a long time as she absorbed the new reality. Stranded on a ranch owned by a man who barely spoke and carried a history she didn't yet understand. In the main room, Boaz leaned back slowly, staring at the fire with a troubled expression that said he didn't know how to make room for another person in his life again. He stayed awake longer than needed, listening to the faint sounds coming from the back room, not out of suspicion, but because he felt responsible for someone he never asked to protect. Neither slept well, neither trusted the situation, but neither wished harm on the other. It It was enough to survive the first night. The storm eased by morning, but the cold inside the cabin still pressed against Tala's skin when she sat up in the small bed, the air sharp enough to sting her throat as she exhaled. She listened for movement in the main room, unsure whether Boaz had slept at all or if he kept watch through the night. Her mind ran through everything she didn't yet understand, whether he planned to treat the forced marriage as binding, whether he expected obedience, whether she would be allowed any kind of autonomy on this land. Those questions pushed at her chest, not with panic, but with a hard and steady tension she needed resolved before the day unfolded further. She stepped out of the room quietly. The floorboards felt cold under her feet, and as she walked toward the main room, she noticed the smell of fresh coffee rising from a dented tin pot on the table. Boaz stood near the stove with sleeves rolled up, stirring a pan of cornmeal with slow movements that matched the careful way he did everything. Deep lines sat beneath his eyes, telling her he hadn't rested much. He turned when he heard her approach, giving a short nod that acknowledged her presence without assuming familiarity. Tala stopped a few paces from him, studying him with a guarded expression, unsure how to begin a day in a place where nothing belonged to her except her choices. The frayed edge of her dress brushed against her thigh as she shifted her weight, and she saw him glance at the tear before he quickly looked away, not out of discomfort, but because he seemed determined not to make her feel cornered. Before she could speak, he cleared his throat. "There's food if you want it." His voice carried a firm, steady tone meant to offer clarity. No demands, no assumptions. Tala stepped closer to the stove, keeping enough distance to move freely. She wasn't hungry, but refusing food would be foolish in winter, so she accepted a bowl when he handed it to her. His fingers brushed the back of her hand by accident, just a faint touch, but it caused a jolt inside her stomach she hadn't anticipated. She tightened her grip on the bowl to steady herself. They sat across from each other at the table. Tala ate slowly, trying to understand more about him through silence. Boaz focused on his own breakfast, but paused every so often as if deciding whether to say something. Eventually, he broke the quiet with a statement practical enough to avoid sounding personal. "Storm's not done for the week. Woodpile's low. Livestock needs checking before the drifts get too high." She listened carefully. His tone wasn't asking her to work, but the message was clear. Survival demanded routine. She needed to know whether he expected her to contribute or stay inside. She asked plainly, "What do you need from me?" Boaz looked up with a faint frown, not from annoyance, but from surprise. She addressed the uncertainty directly. He sat back in his chair, weighing his words as a man who preferred action over conversation. "I don't expect anything you don't choose to do." That answer eased part of the tension in Tala's chest, though it brought new questions. What he believed a marriage was supposed to look like now, what boundaries he thought existed between them, and whether he intended to maintain distance forever. She studied his face for any sign of deception, but found none. Just blunt honesty shaped by years alone. Tala finished eating, set the bowl aside, and asked something else she needed clarity on. What exactly was agreed to yesterday? What were you told? She needed to know how much of her life had been decided without her knowledge. He rubbed the back of his neck, showing the discomfort this topic brought him. The trader said your people owed more cattle than they could pay. Said this was how they planned to settle it. His jaw tightened slightly, and that refusing you would have caused trouble. Tala let the information settle. It matched what she suspected, but hearing it from him forced her to confront the reality that her tribe had traded her with little hesitation. The disappointment hit her harder than she expected, and she looked toward the window to hide the sting in her eyes. Her pride held steady, but the betrayal stayed sharp in her chest. Boaz watched her reaction closely, not with pity, but with a depth of understanding that came from surviving his own losses. He didn't approach or offer empty words. Instead, he said something practical, because he sensed she needed something she could rely on. "You're not bound to anything here except the weather. I won't force you into anything." His tone made it clear this wasn't an attempt to comfort her, but a truth he wanted her to carry into the day. The tension in the room shifted, not softened but leveled. After breakfast, Tala followed him outside with careful steps, wanting to understand the land she was trapped on. The cold bit at her cheeks, and her breath rose in thick clouds. The snow reached halfway up the fence posts, and the corral gate creaked when Boaz pushed against it. He moved with a stiff limp, more noticeable in the daylight, and Tala's eyes traced how his entire stance adjusted to compensate for the injury. The limp wasn't from yesterday's travel. It was old. She realized he must live in a constant dull ache. He didn't mention it. Men like him didn't. As they walked toward the barn, Tala scanned the ranch with a trained gaze, identifying which areas collected the most snow, which parts of the fence sagged, and where predators might slip through after dusk. She had grown up in harshland too. She knew survival demanded awareness of the smallest details. Boaz noticed her assessing the place and slowed his pace, giving her space to walk beside him if she wanted. She didn't join him fully, but she didn't fall behind either. At the barn, they checked the animals together. A few cattle huddled near the back, their breath puffing in quick bursts. A bay mare stomped lightly inside her stall, snorting out warm air. Tala kept her distance at first, but when the mare bobbed her head toward her, Tala moved closer, extending a hand quietly. The horse sniffed her fingers and relaxed. Boaz watched the interaction, intrigued but silent. "You handle animals well," he said after a moment. "I grew up doing it," she answered without bragging, only stating fact. He nodded once, filing that information away. It mattered. Skills meant something out here. They spent the rest of the morning clearing snow from the path around the barn and breaking ice from the water trough. Tala worked with a focus shaped by years of responsibility, and Boaz kept glancing at her with a subtle shift in his expression. Not admiration, not attraction yet, but recognition that she wasn't someone meant to be owned or pitted. She had strength suited for this land. When they returned to the cabin, her fingers were numb. He noticed immediately and set a tin cup of warm broth in front of her before removing his coat. The gesture was small, but she felt the intentionality behind it. He wasn't trying to ease her into obedience or gratitude. He was treating her as someone sharing the same space, the same winter, the same need for warmth. Tala wrapped her hands around the cup, feeling the heat seep into her palms. She watched him stoke the fire with steady movements, and for the first time since arriving, the fear that he might treat her as property eased enough for her shoulders to drop a fraction. He broke the quiet again, this time with a question she didn't expect. "Do you want to send word to anyone? If the weather clears, I could try riding out." She didn't answer right away. The people she once trusted had traded her away. There was no message worth sending. She lifted her chin slightly and said, "There's no one who needs my words." He accepted that answer with a short nod and didn't press further. Evening light settled across the snow outside, casting the cabin in a soft blue glow. Tala sat near the fire while Boaz worked at the table repairing a broken leather strap. Neither spoke, but the silence felt different from the night before. Less tense, more aware. Tala watched the flame flicker against the log and tried to piece together her next steps. Running wasn't possible yet. Staying meant learning how to navigate this unfamiliar man who operated with restraint she didn't fully trust but didn't fear either. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she understood something clearly. Boaz Lorne was not a man who would harm her without cause. His distance came from grief, not hunger. For now, that was enough. And as the fire crackled between them, both understood that the uneasy truce of the first night had shifted into something different, still uncertain, but no longer hostile, leaving room for whatever the next day forced them to face together. The next morning brought a brittle stillness across the ranch, the kind that followed a night of deep freeze. When Tala opened her eyes, her breath formed a faint cloud in the cold room, and she felt the stiffness in her shoulders where yesterday's labor had settled. She rose carefully, adjusting the torn edge of her dress so she could move without catching fabric on the doorway, then stepped into the main room with the guarded calm she carried everywhere now. Boaz was already awake, leaning over a map spread across the table. His hair was damp from melting snow, suggesting he had been outside checking the lines before dawn. Tala paused by the doorway, watching him trace a finger along a boundary marked with charcoal. She realized this was the first time she had seen him focused on anything other than chores or firewood. The map, thick with folds and creases, showed a long stretch of land running up toward the low ridge, and she noticed several marks indicating grazing paths. Yesterday, she had wondered how much land he owned, how he kept it running alone, and why anyone would leave one man to handle so much by himself. Now she saw the answer. He simply did the work because no one else remained to do it. Boaz lifted his head when he sensed her presence. Snowbanks shifted last night, he said, tapping one of the marks. Some fence sections are gone. Wolves start circling when that happens. He folded the map slowly, his expression tightening. We'll need to reinforce the north line. Tala took in the information quietly, understanding what he wasn't saying. This wasn't simply about cattle wandering. Missing fences meant predators could move in closer. Survival in winter required constant vigilance, and the two of them were the only ones capable of holding the line. She stepped closer and asked, "What tools do you have for repairs?" The question caught him off guard, not because she asked, but because she expected to help. He slid the toolbox toward her so she could see the contents. Inside were metal nails, a worn hammer, and strands of wire wrapped tightly around wooden dowels. "We'll take these," he said, "but the walk's long. Snow's deep in some areas." He waited to see if she hesitated. She didn't. Before leaving, Tala took a moment to warm her hands at the fire. As she did, she noticed something on a nearby shelf she hadn't seen before, a small leather journal with pages curling at the edges. It wasn't decorative. It showed signs of being read often, the spine softened by years of use. She stepped closer, but Boaz moved between her and the shelf with a subtle shift of his shoulders. He wasn't harsh about it, only protective. The journal clearly belonged to someone who mattered. He didn't explain, and she didn't ask. But the movement told her what she needed to know. There were memories in this cabin he wasn't ready to share. They stepped outside into snow that reached halfway up Tala's calves. Her breath caught at the sudden cold, but she steadied herself and followed him toward the dim ridgeline. Their footsteps made deep impressions as they climbed the gentle slope. Boaz set a steady pace despite his limp, and Tala noted how he never mentioned the pain, but adjusted his stride to minimize strain. She adjusted her own pace naturally, neither slowing nor rushing him, and that small, unspoken coordination eased some of the tension that still lingered between them. The first missing fence section appeared near a cluster of bare aspens. The wood lay half buried under fresh powder where a snowdrift had pushed it over. Boaz crouched to lift one of the posts, but Tala stepped forward and took the heavier side without waiting for instruction. He looked at her with a brief flicker of surprise. "You don't need to strain yourself." "I know," she replied calmly, gripping the wood with both hands. "But it won't move itself." Her tone wasn't defiant. It was practical. Together they lifted the post and pushed it upright. Boaz hammered the wire into place, and Tala held steady until the line tightened. The work was slow and demanding. Each new section revealed another break. At one point, Tala stopped to brush snow off her face, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Boaz watched her for a moment, noticing her determination and the steady control in her movements. She worked like someone accustomed to harsh conditions, and he realized she was not a burden the way others might have expected her to be. As they moved deeper along the line, Tala asked something that had weighed on her since yesterday. "When the trader brought me, did he say anything else? Anything about why they chose you?" It was a question she had avoided, but uncertainty about her fate gnawed at her. Boaz kept his eyes on the fence he was repairing. "He said your elder didn't want trouble with the surrounding ranchers. They thought giving you to someone who lived far out would keep tensions down." His jaw responded with a faint tightening. "They chose distance, not kindness." The answer stung more sharply than she expected, but she kept her expression neutral. Tala had suspected it was a political move, but hearing it out loud clarified the cold logic behind her exile. She tightened the wire in her hands, grounding herself in the task. By midday, they reached a section where tracks crossed the snow. Tala crouched and studied them closely. "These aren't wolves," she said softly. "These are from a man on foot." She pointed at the depth and spacing. He was moving fast. Boaz bent beside her, his expression sharpening. Nobody should be out here this far unless they're lost or looking for something. He scanned the tree lean, his hand resting near the handle of his revolver. Tala followed his gaze, her instincts tightening. The prince led toward the ridge, not away from it. Could be someone scouting, she suggested. Boaz shook his head. Not in this weather. The tracks continued for several yards before slipping into a narrow pocket of rocks where the wind had erased the rest. Tala rose, brushing her palms against her dress. She felt the tension shift in him, not fear but alertness. Something unsettled him about the tracks. She watched him scan the horizon again, and for the first time since arriving, she saw the protector beneath the quiet exterior. He wasn't merely cautious. He was preparing for something. They reinforced the last section of fence and began the long walk back. The sky carried a pale gray tint, signaling another storm might roll in soon. Tala kept pace beside him, neither speaking for a long stretch. She had many questions, but held them back until her thoughts settled enough to form clear words. When the cabin finally came into view, Boaz spoke with a tone meant to lay new groundwork between them. If someone comes here, you stay behind me. You don't open that door for anyone unless you know their voice. It wasn't a command. It was an understanding of danger. Tala met his eyes. If someone comes here, I stand with you, not behind you. He didn't argue. He looked at her for a moment, measuring her resolve, then nodded once. It was the closest he had come to acknowledging her as a partner rather than an obligation. Inside the cabin, Tala removed her boots and warmed her hands near the fire while Boaz set the toolbox aside. She caught him glancing at her fingers, red from the cold and slightly scraped, and he reached into a drawer for a small tin of salve. He placed it on the table without speaking, letting her choose whether to accept the gesture. After a moment, she opened it and rubbed the mixture over her knuckles. The faint scent of pine filled the air. This time, he didn't look away. He studied her hands with quiet attention, noting every detail. The shift between them deepened, not romantic yet, but human. The tracks in the snow remained on both their minds, but they didn't voice their concerns. The cabin grew dim as afternoon turned toward dusk, and Tala felt a new awareness settle between them. They were two people with different paths forced into the same winter, but today revealed something vital. They worked well together, not because they had been traded into a bond, but because each relied on the other's strength without needing to say it. As the last light faded, Tala sat near the fire and Boaz took his usual chair on the opposite side of the room. Silence stretched between them again, but it was no longer tense or wary. It carried recognition. Outside, the snow fell softly across the land. Inside, something between them shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly enough that both felt it, and both waited, without speaking, to see what tomorrow would demand. Tala woke before sunrise, the cabin dim except for the faint orange glow coming from the bank coals Boaz had covered the night before. The air was cold enough that her breath clouded as she exhaled. She stretched her fingers slowly, feeling the soreness from yesterday's fence repairs. She had worked harder than she expected, yet it gave her something she desperately needed, a sense of usefulness in a life stripped of choice. When she stepped into the main room, she saw Boaz sitting at the table, sharpening a knife with a steady rhythm. His posture was rigid, his shoulders lifted slightly as though he had spent most of the night thinking rather than sleeping. A fresh pot of coffee rested near the edge of the stove, and the smell filled the cabin with a warmth that didn't match the tension on his face. He stopped sharpening the knife when he noticed her. "Tracks yesterday weren't from any of the locals," he said quietly, answering a question she had not asked but had been turning over in her mind. "I checked the rest of the ridge after you went to bed. Whoever was out there wasn't passing through. They were watching something." Tala stepped closer, absorbing every detail. "Watching us. That's what I'm trying to figure out." His voice held a restrained edge, not fear, but calculation. "The snow covered the trail halfway down the ridge, but I found broken branches near the south slope. Someone stayed long enough to scout." Tala folded her arms, thinking through the possibilities. The traitor from before? Boaz shook his head. He wouldn't come back alone. Her eyes narrowed. Someone from my band? It was a question she dreaded asking, because the idea of anyone coming after her now made her stomach knot. If they regretted the trade, they would have come openly. If they wanted her back for reasons not spoken, they would move like shadows. Boaz studied her reaction, recognizing the tension in her jaw. I don't know, but I won't let anyone take you off this land against your will. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The certainty in his tone was enough. The statement stirred something in Tala's chest, an unexpected warmth she couldn't identify, something different from gratitude or relief. She pushed it aside, focusing instead on the day ahead. Boaz stood, pulled on his coat, and opened the door to check the sky. A thin strip of pale gold stretched across the horizon. We need to bring in the cattle from the north pasture before another storm hits. They'll freeze if we leave them out there. Tala grabbed her boots without waiting for instruction. The decision came naturally. She wasn't a prisoner chained to this cabin. She was a woman who refused to be useless. Outside, the air was sharp and dry. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they walked toward the pasture. The distance was longer than expected, and the terrain dipped into a shallow valley that held cold air like a basin. Tala felt the wind cut across her skin, but she didn't slow. Boaz's limp was more pronounced in the deep drifts, and though he never complained or paused, she saw him glance at the far ridge as if calculating how much longer he could push before the pain forced him to stop. Tala stepped ahead and broke the trail through the snow to ease his steps. Boaz noticed. He didn't thank her verbally, but his breathing eased slightly, and his pace steadied. When they reached the pasture, they found 2 cows trapped near a half-collapsed chute. The wooden rails had snapped under the weight of snow, leaving the animals unable to climb out. Tala immediately moved toward them, speaking softly as she approached. The tone of her voice, calm, steady, sure, had an immediate effect. The animals shifted but didn't panic. Boaz circled the fence and inspected the damage. We'll have to guide them out one at a time. The ground under that snow's uneven. Tala positioned herself behind the first cow, guiding it with firm movements and a few sharp clicks of her tongue. Boaz blocked the exit so it wouldn't slip down the slope. When the cow finally climbed out, Tala felt the strain in her legs, but she kept moving to the second one without giving herself a moment to rest. Boaz watched her with a deepening respect he hadn't voiced yet. She wasn't timid, and she wasn't fragile. She belonged to hard land the same way he did. After the animals were freed, Tala brushed snow from her arms, exhaling in exhaustion. Boaz stepped closer, studying her expression. "You're good at this," he said, the sincerity in his tone unguarded. She didn't look away. "I told you. I grew up working. You didn't have to help this much." "I did." Her voice carried no hesitation. The wind picked up again, snapping loose strands of her hair against her cheek. Boaz reached out slowly, brushing the snowflake that caught in her braid. He didn't push the gesture further. He didn't linger. But the brief contact carried a warmth Tala felt down to her chest. For a moment, neither moved. But the silence broke when Tala looked toward the edge of the pasture and saw something tucked between 2 trees, another track. She walked over and crouched, brushing snow aside until the shape became clear. A boot print. Fresh. Boaz joined her, his jaw tightening as he knelt beside the track. "Whoever this is," he murmured, "they're getting closer." The wind quieted, and the only sound came from the distant lowing of cattle. Tala straightened slowly. Why come here? If someone wanted trouble, they would have shown themselves. Boaz stood with her, his eyes locked on the tree-line. Unless they're waiting for the right moment. He scanned the land again, tension building in his shoulders. Then he turned to her with deliberate calm. "From now on, you stay where I can see you when we work outside." Tala didn't argue. She understood the unspoken truths behind the instruction. The man watching them wasn't lost. He wasn't curious. He was planning something. The walk back to the cabin carried a new heaviness. The wind pressed hard against Tala's face, but she kept pace beside Boaz, matching his stride without falling back. Their silence was no longer born of discomfort. It was shaped by shared awareness. Inside the cabin, Boaz lit the lantern and placed it on the table. Tala removed her gloves, flexing her hands until warmth returned. He watched her quietly before saying, "If someone's tracking this ranch, it's not because of me." Tala understood immediately. Her chest tightened, not from fear, but from the realization she had been avoiding since the previous night. "Someone from my band," she whispered, her voice controlled but strained. "Or someone paid by the traitor." Boaz didn't press her. He didn't question her. He simply stepped closer, his tone firm enough to settle any uncertainty. "No one gets to decide your fate except you. Not anymore." For a long moment, Tala held his gaze without looking away. Something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, maybe trust beginning to form, or the early shift of two people forced together by circumstance, but beginning to choose each other in quiet ways neither would admit yet. Outside, snow blew against the windows. Inside, their resolve hardened. The next day would bring answers neither of them wanted, but both of them needed. Tala woke to the sound of boots on the porch, light steps, careful, not Boaz's heavy stride. Her eyes snapped open instantly. The cabin was dim, only a thin band of dawn filtering through the frost-covered window. She listened without moving. The sound repeated, one step, then another, too slow for someone approaching casually and too deliberate for an animal. Boaz was already standing by the door with his rifle in hand, jaw clenched, shoulders squared. He hadn't slept. She saw it in the tightness around his eyes and the stiffness in his back. He tilted his head toward her room so she would stay out of sight, but Tala ignored the signal and stepped quietly into the main room, planting herself beside the hearth where she could react if needed. The footsteps paused. The silence stretched, thick and tense, until a single knock tapped against the wood, soft, measured, almost hesitant. Boaz didn't open the door. "Say your name," he ordered, voice controlled. A breath of cold air slipped through the cracks as a man outside answered. "Elijah Gray. From the settlement east of here." Tala frowned. She had never heard the name. Boaz lowered the rifle slightly, but didn't relax. "Why are you here at dawn?" The man outside hesitated. "I'm looking for someone." "A woman. Said she was brought this way." Tala's chest tightened. Her pulse began to hit faster. Boaz shot her a sharp glance. Half warning, half confirmation of the danger she suspected. He opened the door just enough to see the visitor. Elijah stood in the snow wearing a thick wool coat, scarf up to his chin, cheeks red from wind. He wasn't a threat at first glance, shorter than Boaz, slimmer, unarmed except for a knife at his belt, but his eyes carried something Tala recognized immediately. Fear wrapped in urgency. "What woman?" Boaz asked. Elijah swallowed hard. "An Apache woman. The trader who passed through our settlement said she was taken west. My sister saw the men leading her." His gaze drifted past Boaz's shoulder, searching the shadows inside the cabin, and his voice cracked with something raw. "My wife disappeared 3 days ago. She's Apache," the trader said. "He said perhaps your rancher here acquired one, and—" Tala stepped forward before Boaz could stop her. "I'm not your wife," she said sharply. Elijah froze, realizing how his words sounded. I didn't mean, his breathing turned shallow. "My wife is missing. Her name is Marana. She doesn't speak English well. She carries a small scar by her jaw. If she passed through, if someone saw her, I need to know." Tala studied him carefully. His panic wasn't feigned. His face wasn't hungry with claim or ownership. It was filled with real fear for someone he cared about. She stepped closer, reading his posture, the tremor in his hands, the desperation in his expression. Boaz shifted his stance subtly, keeping the rifle angled to the ground but ready. "We haven't seen her," he said. "No one came through here except the men who delivered Tala 2 days ago." Elijah's shoulders sagged, and his breath left him in a painful exhale. The trader lied then. He said she was sold west, said she was seen near your land. Tala felt a tightening behind her ribs. Something wasn't right. She asked, did the trader give a reason why she'd be taken? Elijah looked down at the snow. Shame crept across his features. "Our settlement doesn't accept Apache folk. We lived outside the main cluster. People talked. People disliked our marriage. When she went missing, they said she ran. but she wouldn't leave without leaving a sign for me. His voice faltered. Someone took her. I know it. Tala absorbed every detail. His sincerity, his fear, his helplessness. Something inside her shifted, a memory of her own betrayal rising with unwelcome clarity. She understood this man's desperation far too well. Boaz closed the door halfway, allowing Tala a private moment with him. You think he's telling the truth? He murmured. Yes, Tala replied. And if Marana was taken, it wasn't by accident. Boaz nodded slowly, mind working through possibilities. Those tracks yesterday, they weren't from him. He'd have approached openly. Tala crossed her arms, the weight of the situation settling heavily. Someone is moving through this land. Someone who knows how to keep distance. Boaz opened the door again, softer this time. Elijah, the tracks we found weren't yours. Someone is watching the ridge. Someone moving quietly. He hesitated, then asked, Does your wife have enemies? Elijah's throat tightened. Anyone who hates Apache people counts. And there are many. Boaz motioned him inside briefly to get warm. Tala watched the man step near the fire, trembling from more than cold. Boaz poured him coffee while Tala kept her distance, studying him with a protective suspicion. She still didn't trust strangers, but Elijah felt like a man stumbling through grief, not danger. When his hand stopped shaking, Tala asked the question Boaz hadn't yet. Why did the traders say, I was your wife? Elijah blinked in confusion. He said that? No, he hates my wife's people. He mocked me when he heard I married her. He'd never mistake you for her. Tala and Boaz exchanged a glance that carried the same realization. The trader wanted someone searching, but not for Marana. For Tala. Elijah looked up, sensing something change in the room. What is it? Boaz answered plainly. Someone wants Tala back, or wants her for reasons we don't know. He took a breath, steady and calm. And whoever made those tracks, he's not scouting livestock. Tala's stomach tightened. She disliked being hunted. She disliked being a piece in someone else's dealings even more. Elijah stood, straightened his coat, and looked at Tala with open apology. I'm sorry for disturbing your home. I just needed answers. He took a step toward the door. But if someone is coming for her, then someone might be coming for my wife too. Tala felt a spark of understanding. The trader was moving women like goods. She was not the first. Marana might not be the last. Elijah's voice trembled. If you learn anything at all, please send word down the valley. I'll keep searching. Boaz walked him out, watching him disappear into the early morning fog. When the door closed again, Tala stood near the fire, her heartbeat steady but her jaw tight. Boaz approached slowly. What are you thinking? That whoever took his wife is connected to those who traded me, she said quietly. And if they want me back, her eyes hardened. They won't stop. Boaz nodded, calm but resolute. Then we make sure they don't reach this cabin. Tala stepped closer, her breath warming the space between them. For the first time, she didn't hide the fear or the anger rising inside her. I'm tired of being moved like an object. Boaz didn't touch her, but he lowered his voice in a tone she had never heard from him before, solid, grounding, certain. No one takes you from here, not while I'm standing. The weight of his promise settled deep inside her. Outside, the wind shifted. Inside, something else shifted too, an alliance no longer born of circumstance, but of shared danger. And the threat stalking the ridge finally had a name in Tala's mind. Whoever they were coming for her, and she was done running. The snow eased by midday, leaving a thin crust of ice along the porch railings as Tala stepped outside to gather more firewood. She scanned the ridge instinctively, searching for any sign of movement. The unease from the boot print yesterday and Elijah's visit still lingered deep in her chest, a quiet warning she couldn't ignore. Boaz locked the stable gate behind him and came toward her with a measured stride. He had spent the morning reinforcing the shutters, his tools left neatly beside the door. We need to talk, he said, voice low. Tala braced herself. There were too many unanswered pieces. Who wanted her back, what the trader had gained by lying, and why a stranger watched their land. Inside the cabin, Boaz set a folded bundle on the table. "These belong to my daughter," he said. Tala froze, unsure how to respond, but he continued with a steady tone. "Clothes that'll keep you warm. Your dress won't hold if we have to move fast." The gesture was unexpected. Practical, not sentimental. She nodded, touched by the trust implied in offering something so personal. She unfolded the garments carefully. A wool coat, thick leggings, leather boots, softened by age. Tala placed her hand on the coat, feeling warmth trapped in its fibers. Boaz stepped back, giving her space, but she saw the strain in his shoulders. Sharing anything from that room cost him more than he showed. Tala broke the silence. "If someone wants to take me, they'll send more than footprints next time." Boaz's jaw tensed. "I know. That's why we're changing how we move." He pointed to the map on the table. "Tracks are near the ridge and the pasture. They're circling. Whoever it is, they know the land well." Then he added something she had not expected. "And they're not working alone." Tala straightened, pulse quickening. "How do you know?" "This morning I found impressions near the stream. Lighter than a full-grown man, but bigger than a child. Someone else is marking the route. 2 trackers, not one." Tala inhaled slowly. "My tribe would never send a pair. And the trader wouldn't risk this far north alone." She pressed her palms against the table as her mind sorted through options. "Then it has to be someone who profits from taking women." Her voice trembled, not from fear but anger. Boaz nodded once. "Which means they won't give up." He turned toward the window, watching the dim sky shift as clouds moved west. "If they're tracking daylight patterns, they'll come when visibility's lowest. Tonight or tomorrow." Tala felt her breath tighten. "We can't just wait for them to knock." "We won't." He motioned for her to sit. "There's something I need to tell you." She hesitated, then sat opposite him. His voice took on a heavier tone. "Years ago, before the fever, I worked with a small patrol out of Silver Rail. We dealt with men who abducted families from traveling groups. They moved fast, changed routes often, always in pairs." His eyes darkened with memory. The man who led them had a scar across his jaw, the same mark Elijah described on his wife. Tala went still. "You think the same men took her?" "I think a trader dealt with them. And I think they traded you for coin." It fit too well. The secrecy, the forced marriage, the lies. Someone had sold her into whatever network these men ran, and Boaz's ranch had simply been the nearest point to drop her. Fury built inside her like a tightening band, but she forced herself to speak calmly. "If they come, we fight. I won't let anyone drag me from here." Boaz sat back slowly, studying her with a quiet resolve. "I know, but you need to understand something." He leaned in, voice steady. "If this turns into a standoff, I'll have to reveal who I used to be. That might draw attention you don't want." Tala knew what he meant. Lawmen, settlers, the kind of attention that saw an Apache woman not as a wife, but as property. "I'm not afraid of your past," she said softly, "but I need to know what you're planning." His answer came without hesitation. "I'm taking you off this land tonight." Tala's stomach tightened. "Running won't fix this." "We're not running," he countered. "We're picking the ground where we stand. If they find us here, they'll burn through the cabin and force us out. Out there," he pointed toward a narrow canyon hidden beyond the ridge. "I know every turn, every blind corner. If they chase us, we control the fight." Tala breathed out slowly. She hated fleeing, but she trusted his judgment more than she expected. "Then we leave when the light drops." She stood and packed what little she owned. Boaz prepared 2 horses, loading his rifle, extra rounds, blankets, and enough food for a single night. When the last of the supplies were tied down, he paused beside her. "You're choosing this," he said, not asking, not warning, just confirming. Tala met his eyes, fierce and certain. "I'm choosing to live." The wind shifted outside, carrying a sound Tala had not heard before, a faint crunch of footsteps far beyond the barn. Boaz extinguished the lantern. "Time's up," and together, they slipped into the growing dusk, leaving the cabin behind as shadows gathered along the ridge where 2 figures watched from a distance. The sky dimmed into a cold blue haze as Boaz and Tala guided their horses along the narrow trail leading away from the ranch. Snow drifted lightly, gathering on their cloaks, and every sound felt sharper, branches shifting, distant wind scraping against rock, the soft crunch of hooves breaking the crusted surface. Tala kept glancing behind them, watching for silhouettes in the growing dusk. Boaz had instructed her to stay close, and she did, though her chest tightened each time the wind bent the trees in a way that mimicked movement. They climbed a steep rise toward the canyon Boaz mentioned. Tala had never seen it before, but she recognized the strategic value instantly. A natural funnel with jagged rock walls narrowing the path into tight bends. Anyone chasing them would have to expose themselves to reach the center. She could see why Boaz had chosen it. As they reached the first bend, Boaz guided the horses into a shallow hollow sheltered by tall boulders. "We'll lead them on foot from here," he said quietly, lowering his voice out of instinct. Tala dismounted, pulling her borrowed coat tight, and helped him guide the horses deeper into the hollow where the snow lay untouched. She noticed something then, a faint set of tracks further inside. Not from animals, but from a person who had passed through days earlier. Tala crouched beside them, brushing away the thin frost. "These aren't new," she murmured. "Someone used this path before, but not recently." Boaz knelt beside her, narrowing his eyes. "They're scouting routes," he said. "They're mapping the area the same way I did years ago." Tala looked at him sharply. "You used to trap men like this." "I used to hunt men who took advantage of others," he corrected, not looking away from the tracks. "That's what I'm doing now." It answered a question she had been holding since the night she arrived. Why a man so carrying grief still watched the land like a soldier waiting for trouble. Boaz wasn't running from his past. He was shaped by it. He motioned her forward, and they continued deeper through the canyon until the walls tightened into a narrow throat where the wind barely reached. Snow lay undisturbed here, thick and soft. Boaz stopped near a ridge of stone jutting out from the wall, its underside hollowed by time. "This will shield us from wind and hide the horses," he said. "We wait here until they show themselves, or until we know they've passed." Tala nodded, though the idea of waiting unsettled her more than fighting. She paced once, testing the ground. The snow was powdery but firm beneath the surface. The canyon walls offered no echo, meaning sound would travel clearly. Useful, but also dangerous. As she walked, Tala asked something she had avoided until now. "Why would these men want me back? They already exchanged me. What use am I to them?" Boaz rested a hand on the saddle horn, thinking carefully before answering. "You weren't traded for dead alone. The trader knew someone who wanted Apache women for sale. When your elder offered you instead of cattle, it saved the trader effort. He never intended to leave you at my ranch permanently." Tala's breath hitched, anger rising hard at her throat. "So they'll come expecting to reclaim what they think they lost." Boaz nodded once. "Yes, but they didn't expect you to be here with someone willing to fight." Tala clenched her fists, grounding herself. She wasn't a helpless prize. She wasn't going back. The wind shifted again, carrying a faint noise from the canyon mouth. Tala stiffened. Boaz drew his rifle without sound. They moved together to the ridge's edge, stepping behind a line of rocks tall enough to shield them while still offering sight of the trail. The sound came again, distant snapping of branches. Tala felt her pulse surge, but her breathing remained steady. A shadow emerged between the trees. Then another. Two men, just as Boaz predicted. They moved slowly, scanning the terrain with the precision of trackers who had done this many times. One was tall, wearing a thick black coat, his posture confident, scanning both sides of the trail. The second was shorter, stockier, carrying a long rifle strapped over his shoulder. They spoke softly, but the canyon carried sound. Tala strained to hear the words. "Should have been right here." Trader said the ranch was close. "Tracks lead west." They couldn't have gotten far. They were hunting her. Not wandering, not guessing. Hunting. Boaz's jaw tightened, and Tala saw something shift in him. A cold clarity she had not witnessed before. Not fear, not hesitation. Preparation. The taller man lifted a spyglass, sweeping the ridge. Boaz pressed Tala's shoulder, guiding her lower behind the rock. His hand lingered a moment longer than necessary, not out of romance, but out of a protective instinct so sharp she felt it through her bones. They don't know the canyon, Boaz whispered. They'll walk right into the narrow ground. That's where we take the advantage. Her pulse steadied. What do you need me to do? He looked at her with a calculated seriousness. I need you to listen. Don't rush. Don't break cover until I say. These men aren't amateurs. Tala nodded once. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't naive. But then she added, I won't hide if you're in danger. A faint exhale left him. Not frustration, something closer to acceptance. I know. They waited. The two men moved deeper into the canyon, weapons ready, senses alert. Tala watched every detail. The way the tall one favored his right side, the way the shorter man shifted his weight before stepping, the scanning pattern of their eyes. They weren't rushing. They were confident. Too confident. Boaz raised two fingers, signal. Then he pointed to the narrowest stretch where the canyon walls pinched the trail into a choke point. Tala understood immediately. They would confront them there, where movement narrowed, where rifles took too long to raise, where the terrain chose the winner. The shadows lengthened as the men reached the choke point. Boaz whispered now. Tala stepped out with him, not behind him, not away from him, beside him. The canyon had held its breath. Now it was ready to break. The canyon tightened around them, the cold air still enough that Tala heard the snow shift beneath the intruder's boots. She and Boaz stepped from behind the rocks at the exact moment the two trackers entered the choke point. The narrow path forced everyone close. No room for flanking or retreat. The taller man reacted first, jerking his hand toward the revolver at his hip, but Boaz already had his rifle raised, barrel pointed directly at the man's chest. Don't, Boaz warned, voice steady enough to cut through the tension. The shorter man froze mid-movement, eyes locked on Tala, as though he recognized her. She read the calculation in his stare, surprise, then certainty. These were men who expected her to be frightened. They expected her to break. Tala lifted her chin instead, grounding her stance. The tall one sneered. So the rancher ain't alone. That complicates things. Boaz didn't look away. State your business. The man stepped forward half a pace. We're here for what was stolen. His tone carried no shame. The woman. She belongs to the trader who paid for her. Tala felt the words hit like a blade pressed against bone, but she kept her breathing even. I was not stolen, she said, her voice cutting across the canyon. I was traded by men who had no right to speak for me. The shorter man's expression hardened. Doesn't change the deal. She's marked for transport. Contract says she's delivered back east. Boaz shifted his grip, his entire frame tightening. She's not leaving with you. The tall man smirked. You think you can stand against all of us? Boaz's eyes narrowed. There are only two of you. A slow, cold grin spread across the man's face. For now, that single phrase confirmed everything Tala feared. More were coming. This pair was only the first wave, meant to find her location, not finish the job. Tala stepped forward before Boaz could stop her, her voice controlled but sharp as flint. Why do you want me? Speak plainly. The shorter man lifted his chin. You fetch a high price. Tall, young, strong. Traders like women who can survive long miles without slowing the convoy. They said you fought them on the way out. Buyers pay extra for spirit. Tala's stomach twisted, not from fear, but from a rising fire that blazed under her ribs. She had been traded like livestock. She had been assigned value without consent. The humiliation cut deep, but the fury steadied her legs. Boaz stepped closer to her, placing himself slightly between her and the men. You won't touch her again. The tall man started to lift his gun. Then we take her by force. Before he cleared the holster, Tala moved. She lunged for the nearest loose stone and hurled it with quick, precise strength. It struck the tall man's wrist, knocking his revolver from his grip. He cursed and grabbed his arm in shock. Boaz fired a single warning shot into the dirt at the shorter man's feet, sending snow bursting upward. Next one isn't a warning. The canyon echoed with the crack, the sound traveling instant and sharp. The tall man stumbled back, realizing too late they had underestimated both of them. This ain't over, he barked, grabbing his wounded partner. They backed out of the choke point, retreating through the trail they had entered from, disappearing into the trees with hurried, uneven steps. The silence afterward felt heavier than before. Tala exhaled slowly, the adrenaline shaking her arms. Boaz lowered the rifle but didn't relax. He watched the path long after the men vanished from sight. "They'll return," he said quietly, "and they won't come alone." Tala brushed the snow from her palms, steadying herself. "Then we don't stay in one place." Boaz turned toward her, the tension in his expression easing only when he saw she wasn't frightened. She was determined. "You moved fast," he said quietly. "I've had to," she answered. "My whole life." Boaz's gaze softened, and Tala felt something shift between them. An understanding deepening, a bond strengthening under pressure neither asked for but both needed. He stepped closer. "We'll head farther into the canyon. There's a hidden split past the ridge. Only people who trapped here would know about it." He paused, voice calmer. "They won't find us there." Tala nodded. "And when they come looking," Boaz met her eyes with a steady gaze. "We choose the place where the fight ends." They retrieved the horses and moved deeper into the canyon as twilight thickened into night. The temperature dropped, their breaths rising in pale clouds. Tala kept close, listening to every sound behind them, knowing the men would return with reinforcements. But she felt no panic. Not anymore, because for the first time since being traded, she wasn't navigating danger alone. She was standing beside a man who chose to protect her. Not because he was required to, not because she was forced upon him, but because he wanted to. And tonight, that made all the difference. Night settled heavy and cold as Boaz and Tala reached the hidden split deeper inside the canyon. A narrow passage shielded by two overlapping slabs of stone. The horses fit through only because Boaz knew exactly where to guide them, stepping sideways and pressing close to the rocks. Beyond the split lay a hollowed basin, wide enough to move freely, yet tucked beneath high ridges that hid any flicker of fire or motion from the valley below. Tala immediately understood why he brought her here. The land itself formed a shield. Anyone entering would choke into a single file line, vulnerable, exposed, predictable. They set the horses near a natural outcrop where wind couldn't reach. Snow drifted softly across the basin, building pale mounds in the corners. Tala collected fallen branches, while Boaz arranged stones into a low wall facing the direction the men would come. Every movement was deliberate, every decision driven by experience neither of them needed to explain. Tala paused as she stacked the wood. She realized something unanswered had lingered since their escape from the cabin. "Boaz," she said quietly, "why did you accept me that day? Even if the traitor forced it, you could have refused. You didn't owe anyone anything." Boaz tightened the strap on his rifle holster before answering. "Because leaving you with those men would have killed you." He kept his back turned a moment longer. "And because when I saw you standing there, you looked like someone who'd already been pushed far enough." He finally faced her, eyes steady. "I couldn't be part of that." The sincerity hit her deeper than she expected. She nodded once, a quiet acceptance of a truth she hadn't dared assume. "You saved me before either of us understood what was happening." He didn't deny it. Before Tala could say more, a distant crack echoed off the canyon walls. She stiffened instantly. Boaz moved beside her, listening closely. The sound came again, branches snapping, snow shifting under weight. More than two men this time. A group, approaching fast. Boaz gestured for her to stand behind the stone wall. "When they enter, they'll aim high to drive us into the open. Stay low. I'll draw their attention." Tala shook her head, stepping beside him instead of behind him. "I'm not hiding while you face them alone." He didn't argue. That silent agreement between them had been forged days ago. Moments later, three silhouettes emerged at the mouth of the narrow passage. One tall, one broad-shouldered, one carrying a lantern that swung in an arc across the canyon floor. Their footsteps scraped against rock, the sound carrying crisp and sharp through the still air. The tall man shouted, "Rancher, we know you're here. Hand over the woman, and no one dies tonight." Tala felt a surge of anger at the word woman, spoken like a possession. She steadied herself, keeping her breath even. Boaz stepped forward, rifle braced against his shoulder. If you want her, walk up here and take her." The tall man laughed, the sound hollow and confident. "How about 5 more behind us? You're outnumbered." Boaz didn't move, didn't falter. "Then come find out what you're walking into." The lantern swung again, and suddenly the men understood the terrain. The path narrowed into a bottleneck. They couldn't spread out. They couldn't flank. Their advantage vanished the moment they stepped into the canyon. The man holding the lantern muttered something urgent, but the tall one shoved him forward. "Go. He won't shoot first." He was wrong. Boaz fired a warning shot at the rock above their heads, sending shards of stone raining down. The lantern bearers stumbled back, dropping the lantern, extinguishing the only light they carried. Shadows swallowed them instantly. Tala moved with quick precision, dragging a snow-covered branch into the choke point and igniting it from the ember Boaz had prepared earlier. The flames flared upward, lighting the narrow ground in a harsh orange glow. The intruders froze, exposed in full view. The broad-shouldered man lunged, trying to charge through the path. Boaz fired again, not to kill, but to disable, hitting the man's thigh and sending him collapsing into the snow with a cry of pain. The others behind him hesitated, realizing they'd been funneled into a trap. The tall man tried to retreat, shouting, "Fall back. We regroup and come from the ridge." Tala stepped forward before he could flee, lifting the stone branch she'd been holding. Her voice carried across the canyon with fierce clarity. "If you come again, I won't let you walk away." The tall man hesitated, thrown off by the controlled fury in her words. He looked between her and Boaz, weighing the risk, and finally spat into the snow before dragging the injured man back toward the trail. The others followed, slipping into the shadows of the canyon until the sounds of their retreat faded entirely. Silence returned, deep and absolute. Tala lowered the burning branch, letting the flames die into the snow. Boaz stepped beside her, lowering his rifle. His breath left him in a slow exhale. "They won't return," he said. "They'll know this land isn't worth dying in." Tala watched the empty passage, ensuring no one lingered. When she finally turned to him, something unspoken hung between them, the recognition of what they had faced and survived together. Boaz approached her slowly, not out of hesitation, but because the moment deserved care. "You didn't hesitate," he said, voice softer now. "You stood with me." Tala's heartbeat steadied, but her voice remained firm. "I stood where I chose to stand. I'm done letting others decide my fate." He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against hers, not claiming, only connecting. She didn't pull away. The contact felt earned. She stepped closer, resting her forehead against his chest, letting her breath settle against his warmth. Boaz wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her gently, the first time he allowed himself such closeness. After a long moment, Tala whispered, "What happens now?" Boaz lifted her chin slightly, so she would meet his eyes. "Now we go home. Together." The word home settled through her like a weight finally lifted. They returned to the ranch by sunrise, tired, cold, but alive. The cabin stood exactly as they left it, untouched by danger. Tala walked inside first and felt something unfamiliar but welcome, a sense of belonging. Boaz followed behind and closed the door with a quiet finality. "You stay here as long as you choose," he said, voice grounded and certain. "And if you choose to stay forever, I would welcome that." Tala stepped toward him, placing her hand on his chest where she had rested the night before. "I choose this," she said. "I choose you." Boaz cupped her face gently, and their foreheads touched in a quiet, deliberate closeness. No fear, no uncertainty, only mutual choice. Outside, the wind moved softly across the land. Inside, Tala and Boaz began a life not formed by trade, force, or survival alone, but by the decision to stay beside one another, morning after morning, for every winter that followed. And their story ended where all chosen families begin, with safety, with warmth, and with the clear knowledge that neither would ever face the world alone again.